Das Bundesverfassungsgericht hat den Paragraphen 217 für verfassungswidrig erklärt. Was bedeutet das jetzt für unsere Gesetzgebung in Deutschland? Begleiten Sie uns auf unser Symposium zusammen mit kanadischen Kollegen. In Kanada besteht eine liberale Gesetzgebung schon seit Jahren und es geht jetzt darum, was die Konsequenzen in der Gesellschaft dort sind. Herzlich willkommen an alle, die uns heute zuhören wollen über die beabsichtigten und die nicht so beabsichtigten Konsequenzen von einem Land wie Kanada, wo eben Medical Aid in Dying möglich ist. Herzlich willkommen an alle and especially heartily welcome to our guest speakers today and our Canadian speakers. Normally I could ask you at that point, how was your flight? But this is not the case today. It's the advantage and of course disadvantage of virtual symposia. Especially welcome, and now I can see you as well, Gary. Hello. Professor Gary Roden, I may introduce you first. You are chair of psychiatry. You are the chair of the Department of Supportive Care at the largest Canadian cancer center, Princess Margaret in Toronto. And you are also the director of a global institute of Psychosocial, Palliative and End-of-Life Care. Herzlich willkommen, Gary Roden, live from Toronto. And also, Madeleine Lee. When we met first, you introduced yourself and said Madeleine, and you had to become a psychiatrist, right? Because of that first name, Madeleine Lee. You are head of psychosocial oncology at Gary's department. You are a psychiatrist, as I said, and you are very instrumental and have a lot of experience, of course, also with the medical assistance in dying concept, which you put up at Princess Margaret. Herzlich willkommen also for Madeleine Lee. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'll introduce our panel discussants later on. But maybe, Gary, the two of us, we will facilitate this meeting. Maybe you tell everybody what they will be able to expect and maybe not expect today.
Yes, well, we hope today will be a very interesting dialogue. Germany is in some respects in the same position Canada was in about 5 years ago when assisted dying was introduced in our country. And in conversation with Raymond, we thought it might be interesting to have that kind of a dialogue, as if it were a case consultation, that Germany is now faced with this problem, and we might be able to generate discussion and dialogue based on our experience in cancer in the last 5 years. This is a rapidly changing field and practice. Raymond and I were remembering that we had a symposium that was sponsored in Germany, in Cologne, about 7 years ago, and assisted dying was not legal in either country, and so it was a kind of what-if symposium, and this is really in the opposite direction. From the Canadian perspective, it's looking back and saying, what wisdom have we gained, and what advice do other people have about how Germany might now proceed? So we're delighted to be here, and particularly in this kind of interdisciplinary dialogue, which we've, I think, shared a common interest in on a subject like this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. And I'm sure, Gary, we can promise to have another symposium in 5 years' time. And then maybe we will be talking about, well, not only assisted dying, but maybe killing upon request in Germany. We'll see, and we'll discuss that, what comes up with our national discussion. Well, thank you very much indeed. As a first speaker, before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to introduce the main person of today, which is Kathleen Boström, because after our talks, we have 3 talks and we have a panel discussion, and then it's your time of discussing with us. And Kathleen Boström, you are a psychologist working with us mainly in research area, and you tell us how people can discuss and chat with us and raise their hands, maybe.
Exactly, yeah. A warm welcome from me too. We have 2 options to communicate today. If you have a question or a remark, you can either write in the chat And I'll see what you wrote, and I will communicate it to Professor Voltz, and he will ask the question to the speakers or answer it himself. Or you can, in the breaks we have between the sessions, you can just raise your hand and use the raise hand symbol in your Zoom call to do that. And then you can ask a question via your video and your audio, and we can hear you in the meeting. So far for communication. I would also like to add that we will upload this video of the whole session to YouTube, to our University Clinic YouTube channel. And you can watch it later if you want to, or share it with colleagues. And we also have a journalist today who will use the video to further spread the discussion in the media. And I think that's about it for today.
So if you don't agree, switch off and
Exactly.
watch it on YouTube later. Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, for introducing that. Well, let's start with the program. And I'm very happy to announce Sylvia Hartwig from our federal ministry. I have always to read it up, Frau Hartwig, because in German even it's long. We always call it the family ministry. But it's the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth. And we are connected, and I'm very happy about this, for long have been connected with palliative care and also our department for a long time with several projects. And today's meeting also marks the kickoff of yet another project. Well, thank you very much for giving us first words, Sylvia Hartwig from Berlin.
Thank you very much, Raimund Voltz. And first of all, I have to apologize in advance, because just in the moment somebody started to work with the drill here, and I don't know what's going to happen while I'm speaking. So I hope everything is going well. So dear experts, on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth, I warmly welcome you to the symposium widening the scope of assisted suicide. By organizing this symposium with Gary Rodin, Raimund Voltz really, and his team really for the, and his team for the Center for Palliative Medicine in Cologne have really chosen a quite interesting start for our joint project, Desire to Die, developing digital teaching methods. So for our ministry, it is very important to support hospice and palliative care. We know, especially at the end of life, humans are particularly vulnerable, and they are weak. They need help and assistance. They need those who take care. And those who take care, may they be professionals, volunteers, or family members, are frequently confronted with the desire to die, with the wish to be dead. And in many cases, they report their uncertainty about how to deal with the situation, about good ways of talking about the desire to die. And that's what former studies of Raimund Voltz tell us. So as federal ministry that cares for the carers, we looked for support for them and started the NAME project just a few days ago, on the 1st of June. Of course, end-of-life topics are debated much more frequently in consequence of the last year's decision of the Federal Constitutional Court, according to which the assisted suicide pursuant to Section 217 is no criminal offense. Whatever legal framework for an assisted suicide will be established in Germany, it seems not only interesting, but indeed necessary to listen and to learn from these end-of-life debates, the end-of-life dialogues. The today's symposium will contribute to these discussions and open them towards an international perspective. So thank you very much for you, Gary Rodin, and you, Madeleine Lee. On behalf of the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, I wish all of us a fruitful exchange. And thank you very much.
Ja, danke schön.
Thank you. I think we're now going to hear from Raymond. Many people here will know Raymond Voltz. Raymond is the chair of palliative medicine in Cologne. But beyond that, he's really been a European and international leader in the field of palliative care. He's played an important role in the establishment of guidelines for palliative care. He most recently is leading a large project on the desire for hastened death. And I think most importantly, from my point of view, he has a broad and humanistic vision for the delivery of palliative care. And I think it's that kind of broad, humanistic, and interdisciplinary approach that I think has created a bond between us over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of these kind of shared activities. So we're now going to hear from Raymond about the German case from which the rest of our discussion will proceed. So Raymond, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gary, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to set the scene for our discussion today, to present in a clinical case, as you said, the German case. And for all these discussions, it's always nice, also in patients, but also here, to have a history of the problem and a general history first. So Germany, maybe for you Canadians, it's a country we think is a very heterogeneous country from the roots. We were hundreds of kingdoms. At the moment, we have like 16 federal states. As we say here in Cologne, jede Ecke ist anders. Das heißt, this means everybody is different. We also consider ourselves to be a land of poets and thinkers, which I think is something different from the Anglo-Saxon, more pragmatic side of life. The Germans come from the more normative side of life, and Dieter Birnbacher, you are the philosopher, you can tell us about that later. Of course, we have a Nazi history, 75 years and more later, and I think, and maybe that's normal, that all these arguments are fading away into history, maybe. We had in more recent years, of course, this reunification history where a major proportion of our society comes from a communistic, atheistic background. And if you think that we are now, and the number is growing, 40% of our population do not belong to any church anymore. We had then the immigration crisis, which of course also brought some political destability, crisis of established structures. We have a right-wing party now in our parliaments. All the fake news discussion, Trumpism is all about, also in Germany, of course. We are expecting a general election in September, which is also relevant to our discussion. And again, we expect the former major parties to lose again in their proportions. The Christian churches, they have to deal with sexual crimes. Just at the moment, there are 2 visitators from the Pope in our community in Cologne, and some people say it's easier to get an appointment for vaccination rather than an appointment for getting out of church. So that really is a problem. We are expecting, or we are seeing a sort of antagonism between parliament and federal constitutional legislation and jurisdiction in major areas, not only in end-of-life care, but also EU politics, climate crisis, and of course, through all the pandemic situation, all our societies are strained, and we all see the weaknesses, and also we have a feeling that we all, as individuals, have to deal with these things, and maybe some things which should be there are not there. So in general, and this is also the analysis of sociologists here in Germany, we feel that the consensus on the orientation, how we want to live, is diminishing. And this is also true, of course, then reflects on the end-of-life discussion. And as you can see here, I think also in contrast to several other countries, we already have quite a few options in end-of-life care. There's one red, one forbidden thing, which is killing upon request. And that's different from Canada. You are assisting, and aid in dying mixes up killing upon request and assisted suicide. For us, it's completely different. It's from the normative side is who takes the final responsibility of action. And therefore, at the moment, we are talking about assisted suicide. But Gary, as I said, maybe in 5 years' time, we'll talk about killing upon request, because the first voices have started also on the normative side of things from this discussion around assisted suicide to talk about changing paragraph 216. But now, for the time being, we talk about assisted suicide in Germany. That's our situation, our discussion point. The discussion starts that attempted suicide, and that's also different from some other countries, is no criminal offense and has been for a long time, as you can see here. And therefore neither is assisting, for nobody. So you're talking about medical, we are talking about everybody. Everybody is not a crime to assist in suicide. Having said that, however, and we will hear about this later from the German Medical Association, it was not allowed to do so for physicians. So this was on the professional right from the German Medical Association. At the same time, there has been no prosecution for decades on this. So in practice, physicians were indeed assisting in suicide, but in a sort of gray area. In November 2015, after a longer discussion in our parliament and a majority decision, for the very first time the topic of assisted suicide became part of our criminal code, this paragraph 217 we are talking about now. And it started with this discussion that for 7,000, 8,000 euros, you could get this service from organizations. And this was forbidden, was put into the criminal code, businesslike. Assisting in suicide became part of the criminal code. Of course, these sort of organizations, but also many people argued against that, also some palliative care physicians who said that by me being a physician, if I do it once, it's like a business, it's like an organization, and I'm doomed to do it a second time, and therefore it's organized, and therefore I fall under this legislation. In February 2020, our Federal Constitutional Court declared this paragraph unconstitutional, completely unconstitutional. The reasoning was that they say that the state is not allowed to de facto double block suicide assistance because it's the right of everybody. The double blocking would be this paragraph 217 plus the verdict of the German Medical Association. Because everybody has the right for suicide and therefore getting assistance. If, of course, there is a free will autonomous consistence. However you measure that in practice, but that's the normative side and normative reasoning. No reasons must be given. It shouldn't be reasons where somebody else, a third party, should be judging those reasons. It is your reason and that's it. So it's not restricted to advanced disease. You're talking about medical assistance in dying. We are talking about everybody. Not restricted to advanced disease or any other specific life situation. Having opened these doors very widely, at the same time, the court ruled that nobody can be forced to assist in suicide. Whether that's true that also institutions may not do it remains open. So is a hospice, is a university hospital allowed not to offer it? That's a question. It remains open. Assisting in suicide should not become a normality. The court also ruled, whatever that is. And when does it become a normality? And what is normal? And they said, well, dear Parliament, you may now also restrict again the use by passing another law. This was the ruling. 2 days later, Corona hit the country, and so there was a double shock to some extent. This very open court ruling and the pandemic, and so it really took months before reactions came in. The German Ethics Council has held 2 public hearings. They didn't issue a statement yet. Of course, for palliative and hospice care in Germany, it was also not very easy because, as you know, the WHO definition includes not prolonging life, but at the same time also not shortening life. And Claudia Bausewein can talk about that later from the perspective of the German Palliative Care Society. The German Hospice Association started a dialogue with quite a nice methodology in that organizations can think of critical situations, and then they can see what are the principal categories of how to react and where are our green lines, where we always want to go that way, and where are our red lines, where we should not go over. On the political aspect, there were, of course, many discussions. I just cite here a cross-party member of parliament group on hospice. They consulted, they talked about this also on where we argued a lot in favor of suicide prevention, and Barbara Schneider will talk about that later. Suicide prevention would be a major point. Having said that, the second part of the discussion, have we lost them? And the second part of the discussion, however, it became clear how difficult this is, and this is the maybe unintended consequences. We talked about specialized palliative care
just
teams,
wait a moment
and whether psychologists should be part of that.
I think your microphone is off.
Okay. I can continue. I get that sign, so I can continue, and I hope you can hear that. So in that cross-party member of parliament's group on hospice, we talked about suicide prevention at the first time, in the first part of the meeting, and at the second part of the meeting, we had then the psychologists, the discussion around specialized palliative home care teams that no psychologist so far is paid for in these teams. So if we are really honestly talking about suicide prevention in severely ill patients, not alone otherwise, people with other illnesses, then not having a psychologist in a specialized palliative home care team is a contradiction in itself. The Ministry of Health collected about 50 statements because they were not quite sure what to do really, I have the feeling, put them on the internet. Finally, only a few weeks ago, put out a first draft of the new legislation for discussion. There were other cross-party membership groups who put out first drafts for possible suicide assistance laws now. There was an orientation debate in April, but a decision on that topic, whether there will be a new law and how should this new law look like, will only be made after the decision, after the election. The only thing is, which is really a first step now, was that the German Medical Association just a few weeks ago abolished that prohibition. They abolished the prohibition that a physician is not allowed to assist in suicide. At the same time, they said it's not a duty for a physician either. So, which means that there will be no fees associated with that. There will be no, it will be not part of the medical curriculum, and there will be no guidelines. Sind alle verschwunden oder geht's? Alles gut. You can still hear me because you are vanishing out there. But you are there. Okay. Now, the final slide for you, Madeleine and Gary. So, is it possible to have a safeguard concept? And how could this really look like? That's an important issue. So, what should be the suicide assistance law? What parts should be in that? But on the other side, on the suicide prevention side, is it possible to prevent unintended consequences which might occur, which would be important to put into a suicide prevention law? And then more on a theoretical basis, all these laws they name themselves self-determined dying, or you know that, dying with dignity, and it means not palliative care, it means assistance in suicide or euthanasia. So there is a biased nomenclature use, of course. And by passing a law, does this by itself make assistance in dying a normality, which the court said it shouldn't be? Or maybe we are all on the same path. In all different our Western countries, we are going into the same direction, and some countries are slower than others. So, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion now. Well, then, I think, Gary?
Yes, so maybe
the Canadian
questions
side
will emerge questions will emerge, I think, Raymond, as we go along. I think people are probably trying to absorb it and take it in to start with. And I think you presented very well the German situation. And I think Madeline is now going to help us understand something about the Canadian situation. Madeline is an international leader in the field of psychosocial oncology. She heads that division at Princess Margaret Cancer Center. She's a scientist, she's a clinician, and she's been a leader in the development of assisted dying and the framework, which she's going to describe at the University Health Network, which has been adopted nationally and in other parts of the world. I've known Madeline, I think, as a colleague and partner even longer than I've known Raymond, and we've spent many hours during the day and after hours, I think, agonizing over all of the questions related to assisted dying. So, Madeline, please, looking forward to your telling us about the Canadian situation.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Just please confirm for me that you can see my slides.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to this topic. I do hope in 5 years' time that I can come to Germany to do the next version of this. To me, that's a downside of the pandemic. I'm going to tell you about our experience and the evolution of assisted dying in Canada over the last 5 years. I thought I would start by just describing sort of the different regimes in the world. So globally, and you know, we know that there are, as Raymond said, this euthanasia is what you call killing upon request, or physician-assisted dying, where a patient self-administers, and there are differences between where that is legal. In general, where countries have more permissive laws, they allow both, and have no requirement for a terminal illness. And that's the Benelux countries. And where that is allowed, generally they also allow for the more controversial areas of allowing assisted dying for children in mental illness and as an advance request. Whereas countries like the United States and the countries that have more recently come onto legalizing assisted dying, they restrict to physician-assisted dying. You do need to have a terminal illness with a prognosis of less than 6 months, and they don't allow for any of the controversial areas. And then Canada wound up being something oddly in the middle, where we are quite liberal in that we allow euthanasia and physician-assisted dying, but tried to restrict. It was a very Canadian law. It was really trying to keep a compromise and all parties happy, and they don't require a terminal illness, but did require initially this concept called a reasonably foreseeable natural death, and then did not allow for any of the controversial areas. But then, as I will be describing, the laws have evolved, and reasonably foreseeable natural death has now changed, and we will be allowing, at least for mental illness, in a couple of years. And of course, that's what we're here to talk about today. Let's see what happens with Germany, and can we help inform your discussions? Similar to what Raymond was saying, one of the reasons why this is happening in Canada is because in Canada, suicide is not illegal. So that was decriminalized in 1972. And the reason was really because it was felt a prohibition or a legal determinant wasn't necessary. And after they decriminalized suicide, there's been no escalation in suicide rates. The case that really sparked assisted dying laws in Canada was Sue Rodriguez, so a woman with ALS who applied in 1992 to the Supreme Court, and her case was denied. And the reasons given then were because of the values of society and sanctity of life, that this was a priority to the populace. And they cited the risk of abuse to vulnerable populations if they were to remove the sanction against assisting in death. And she ultimately did have an assisted death that was not investigated. But then this evolved to 2015 when there was a key case in the Supreme Court of Canada by Kay Carter and Gloria Taylor, two women with osteoarthritis, with chronic conditions, osteoarthritis, spinal stenosis, so pain from that, progressive paralysis with Kay Carter, and Gloria Taylor had ALS. Neither of these women ultimately received assisted dying, but their case was successful. And it was actually based on the finding that there was a violation prohibiting assisted dying, violated two sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. And that was Section 7, the right to life, liberty, and Section 15, the right to equal benefit. And that was because it was felt that there would be people, if suicide is legal and you have a right to do this, there would be people who, with progressive disabilities, who would need to end their lives sooner while they still physically were able to do so. So they were actually losing potential life because they would have to take action themselves. And therefore, they were being discriminated against in Section 15 by not allowing others to assist them in the death. And the court also felt that, unlike the expanding indications for assisted dying globally, that we could put in sufficient safeguards to protect vulnerable populations. So the reasons why Sue Rodriguez was denied really was felt not to apply here. And so the ruling Canada came up with was that it was unconstitutional to prohibit assisted dying. And their criteria were quite broad. So the legal ruling is you need to be a competent adult who gives consent. You did need to have a medical condition. And then there had to be suffering that was intolerable to the individual. And I think what is key to this is that that's a very broad definition. And it left Canada open to potentially having one of the most liberal assisted dying laws in the world, not as liberal as what you're currently considering in Germany. But what wasn't clear at the time was what mandate the government had to enact this. And it's interesting, if you look at Canadian public opinion polls, and these are both really requisitioned by advocacy organizations, Dying with Dignity Canada and Cardis, which is a faith-based think tank. The way they ask their questions and interpret their data, of course, reflect their advocacy. But if you look at the recent data that they have shown, Dying with Dignity would say that 87% support the Carter decision. But another way of looking at this data is that almost half are not in strong support of the Carter decision. And that pretty much mirrors what the Cardis poll shows, in that they asked, do you have concerns about expanded access? And half of the population are cautious supporters because they do have concerns. And based on that, I think the government came up ultimately in 2016 with Bill C-14, which outlined our legislation around how we're going to operationalize the Supreme Court decision. And they came up with substantive safeguards, which are the eligibility criteria for receiving assisted dying, and then grounded the procedural safeguards in medicine as a way to protect the vulnerable. And I won't go over them in detail, but basically you need to be an adult and capable. The most controversial part of the eligibility criteria has been that they defined a grievous and irremediable condition, which is what the Carter ruling said you needed to have. You needed to have a condition with these 4 criteria. You had to have an incurable condition. You had to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability and in function. There had to be enduring both either physical or psychological suffering. And you had to, and then the most complicated part, you had to have this concept of a natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. So this reasonably foreseeable natural death. And specifically, they said you didn't have to provide any specific prognosis around that. And then there were a number of procedural safeguards in medicine, including a 10-day reflection period and the requirement for the patient to be competent at the last moment, still capable of providing express consent when they receive assisted dying. So we tried to operationalize that at UHN, at our institution. And to Raymond's point, institutions in Canada are not required to provide assisted dying. They are required to facilitate access to it. And so many organizations have opted out. We created a framework that was trying to balance this issue of autonomy versus protection, partly because, again, it wasn't clear from those public opinion polls what the majority of the populace felt like. Do they prioritize autonomy over protection? And so we developed a very tightly safeguarded process, which I could talk about for hours. It has been published, so I won't talk about it for hours. To summarize, though, we bypassed the issue of conscientious objection by creating voluntary teams of clinicians who would participate in assisted dying. And we actually divided it up to safeguard the patient into 4 processes. We very much involve the clinical team who have the initial conversation with patients about their goals of care, how to respond to an initial expression of the desire for death. The team works together with 2 an assessment team and an intervention team, and we kept these separate so that people could work within the scope of their expertise. The assessment team assesses patients against the legal eligibility criteria, and as much as possible, we tried to match the patient with the expertise of the assessor. So an oncologist for a cancer patient, a psychiatrist if there are mental health concerns. And then the intervention team were the people who actually do the final capacity and desire to proceed check and provide the lethal injection. People used to dealing with lethal medications and complications, although there have been none. And I think what has been important was we also included a staff support team that were bioethics, psychiatry, social work, spiritual care, to provide debriefs to our healthcare providers before and after MAID provisions. The most important part of our framework is what's in yellow here, that throughout the process, we ensured that either the clinical team or the people shepherding the patient through the MAID process would optimize disease and symptom control and ensure access to either palliative care or psychosocial oncology as needed. So that was our framework, and we, what's happened in Canada is over the last 4 years, there's been an increasing number of cases. We now are at, up to the end of 2019, there were over almost 14,000 MAID cases in Canada. That number is surely over 20,000 by now. But things shifted for us with this particular legal ruling. In 2017, there was the case of AB, a 77-year-old woman with severe osteoarthritis. And what happened with her request for MAID is there was disagreement amongst her assessors, and the first assessor approved her, the second did not. A third did approve her, but by then the first assessor withdrew because there was controversy about did she qualify as having a reasonably foreseeable natural death. And so she took that to court where they decided that she did have a reasonably foreseeable natural death because 2 physicians had determined that she had. And so really it was that RFND is a clinical, not a legal determination. Didn't need to come to court, 2 physicians, so she has one, so she does. But it provided case law that really your natural death does not need to be imminent. You don't need a specific prognosis, the law already said that, and that your natural death can be related to your overall condition. What this had the effect of was helping clinicians become very much more comfortable with longer prognoses. And if you look at the rates of assisted dying globally, so in countries with more permissive laws, you see over time an escalating rate of assisted dying in the Benelux countries, for example, whereas in countries where there were more restrictive laws to terminal illness, it's been fairly stable in terms of the prevalence. This is the percentage of assisted dying compared to total deaths. And you see in Canada, we had this steep beginning up to 2017, where people were learning about the availability of assisted dying. I don't know if it's related to the Peril case, but after 2017, rather than plateauing, what we saw was actually quite a sharp increase. And now we're at 2% of all deaths in Canada are from assisted dying. And we've managed this 1% increase in just 2 years, whereas it took 6 to 8 years, even in the Benelux countries, to get that kind of increase. What underlies that, has it been because some of the cases that people have been more comfortable with fall into this category of tired of life or completed life cases? Depending on which side of the debate you're on, you'll use a different term. But basically, these are patients without a clear medical condition who are done with their lives. This is really only legal in Belgium and accounts for 25% of their cases, but it has been tabled in the Netherlands. I would say that probably it has been happening in Canada, although it's technically not legal, because you do need to have a medical condition. But we have a large proportion of cases approved for frailty, and really life is a terminal condition. You don't get to 80 or 90 without COPD or some kind of medical condition that could qualify you for MAID. And certainly in what we've heard about the German law, as it currently stands, this could be possible in Germany. The Netherlands actually, as they're examining this, did do a study, a qualitative study of people who felt that life was complete and were interested in assisted dying. And what they describe, their qualitative themes they pull out, describe this aching sense of, as their reasons for wanting to die, an aching sense of loneliness, not mattering, inability to be authentic to who they were, this multidimensional sense of tiredness with life, and an aversion towards dependence. Some would say that this is a description of a vulnerable person. Others would say this is a competent decision. I don't know if that is what underlies what happened with our sharp increases in MAID rates. I do know that I expect those rates to go further up rather than down, and increase to meet what's happening in the Benelux countries and probably exceed them. In fact, I meant to say there are sections of Canada where the percentage of deaths due to MAID are actually in excess of what we see in the Benelux countries. I expect those numbers to increase because there was this recent Supreme Court challenge in 2019 from, there are two of them actually, Julia Lamb and the Truchon and Gladue case. The Lamb case was a 25-year-old woman with spinal muscular atrophy. And through the deliberations, it became clear that actually her case was heard in British Columbia, a specific province in Canada with very high rates of MAID. And what became clear was that she actually could likely qualify under the existing law with reasonably foreseeable natural death intact. These were challenges to the reasonably foreseeable death criterion in Bill C-14. And because she could have been found eligible, she actually withdrew her case. In contrast, Truchon and Gladue were seen, that case was tried in Quebec, a province that actually has a separate law specific to Quebec where patients must be at the end of life. So in Quebec, it's really restricted to terminal conditions. And these were two patients, again, with chronic conditions, a 51-year-old with cerebral palsy and spinal stenosis, and a 73-year-old woman who had a post-polio syndrome since the age of 4, but also now reduced lung capacity and scoliosis. And their case was successful. So they, based on their challenge to the Supreme Court, reasonably foreseeable natural death was repealed. The government decided not to challenge that and instead legislated Bill C-7. And that had the effect really of taking this reasonably foreseeable natural death and removing it from an eligibility criteria in C-14 so that it becomes an issue of access. So now what they have is two parallel streams in Canada in C-7, and what I'm listing here are the new safeguards. All the several of the elements that were in C-14 still stand. You still need to have 2 assessors and things like that, but what's changed is they've eased some of the requirements in terms of witnessing. They've eased access for those who do have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. So you now don't need to have a 10-day reflection period, and you don't need necessarily to be competent at the last moment. So you have this option of a waiver of a final consent, which isn't the same as an advance directive because you do need to have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. So it's not that you can have dementia and request this 20 years from now. But it is easier for people who are soon to be dying. For those who are not, they put in additional safeguards. So you cannot waive your final capacity. You need now to have a 90-day reflection period. And you need to have your assessors be informed by some expertise in the medical condition. You actually not just have to be informed of the availability of palliative care and alternatives to relieve suffering, but you have to be offered consultation in some form. And the person, not that you have to accept it, but you have to be offered it. And the assessor has to determine that the person has appropriately considered these reasonable alternatives to relieve their suffering. Whereas in C-14, it was really just up to the patient. If you say you're suffering, we can't question that. Now the assessor has to decide that you have appropriately considered. The challenge with this pathway is that they actually still have not defined what reasonably foreseeable natural death is. And that's always been a challenge. And it still sits now as a challenge. And so I come to several considerations that I think would be wonderful to talk about, is that I think in some ways, not defining reasonably foreseeable natural death means that the safeguards put into C7 will be limited, right? Because it's up to the clinicians now who goes down which path. And I think medicine probably hasn't safeguarded the practice because of the lack of definition. And assisted suicide is not the same as suicide. As I think I've shown you, suicide rates didn't increase after decriminalization. Assisted dying rates will increase without some legal criteria around who goes down which path. In some ways, I think this is interesting because if we go back to the legalities around why assisted dying was legalized in Canada, those without a reasonably foreseeable natural death actually can suicide without assistance because they're not imminently at risk of losing the physical ability to end their lives. And so in some ways, medicine hasn't been maybe an adequate safeguard. Does this process need to involve medicine at all? Which I think is one of the questions that is in Germany. And I think what would help inform that is that it is still unclear whether there is a public mandate to support assisted dying, where you do have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, because you're dying anyway and we're going to assist that process, versus assisted suicide, where you don't have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, you're not happy with your life. I think it's that the public largely still believe that and all those polls, the agreement with Carter is because they believe that MAID is for patients with unbearable end-of-life suffering. I'm not sure the public in Canada are really aware of really the availability of assisted suicide as part of C7, which brings me to this final consideration of whether what we're trying to do, is there really either a moral or societal distinction between easing the pain of dying and easing the pain of living? And that's the distinguishing feature between those two pathways. Because in many ways, again, the German legislation says not to normalize suicide. But I think that if you're going to position easing the pain of living, then it does normalize suicide as a rational alternative to suffering. Is that good or bad? I'm very struck. This is a new world, a brave new world we've entered. And I always think of Christopher Hitchens' quote in Mortality, where he's who had cancer, and his phrase was, "I no longer use the term, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Because in the brute physical world, there are many things that don't kill you and then leave you considerably weaker. And what we do with that, whether we give you dying for that or not, is either dystopian or enlightened, depending on whether you're reading Huxley or Shakespeare. But I will leave the tour of what happened in Canada there and hand over to Gary to talk about next steps and implications.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Actually, we could pause and see if there are any questions that people want to raise at this point. But Madeline, or the Canadian situation, we'll have a time for discussion later, but are there any questions that have come through the chat at the moment?
I think
there's a hand.
Gary. Yes.
There's a hand. And we also have a question in the chat from Lillian Thorpe, who wrote that MAID assessment, so medical assistance in dying, has become much more difficult in Canada after the removal of the requirement for reasonably foreseeable natural death. And she has assessed over 550 patients now, so she has a lot of experience. That's a remark from, a few minutes before you started your talk, Madeline.
Do you want to comment on that, Madeline?
Thank you, Lillian, for the comment. Yes, I agree. I think it has become much more difficult. One thing I didn't raise was, the topic of selective conscientious objection. I think what our laws have done is put us in a position where clinicians will need to be deciding, do they want to provide on both paths, and how they will decide that.
Okay, then I see Claudia Bausewein and Sylvia Hartwig want to say something.
Thanks, Madeline, for this really interesting presentation. I just wondered whether you can tell us what the proportion is between assisted dying in sort of killing on request and assisted suicide, because I find that always confusing looking at the numbers of countries where both is possible, and it's then sort of collected under the umbrella of medical aid in dying. And that's for me quite a shift actually, but that's a different discussion. But I just wonder about the proportions between assisted dying and killing upon request in Canada.
99% of MAID deaths are by assisted by euthanasia, by lethal injection, 99%. There are many reasons behind that. Initially, the medications weren't that available, were very expensive, but also it's more challenging to safeguard self-administering. And there have been some initial cases that did not go well, and I think scared off a lot of providers.
Because that's the sort of similar numbers, maybe not as sort of harsh as in Canada, in the Netherlands and Belgium, where it's 5% assisted suicide and 95% killing upon request. And I think that's really important for our discussions, because in a way, numbers and discussions are sort of only to a certain extent comparable, because you're talking about something different than we are talking. And I just wanted to make that clear, which doesn't mean that we have to learn a lot from you. And it's very important to hear your experiences. Thank you.
I think that's something that may come up in the discussion, by the way, is what are the differences? I mean, there's a literal difference, but how different do these two approaches represent something fundamentally different? Would be something interesting to discuss in terms of responsibility or consequences or protection.
I can see that Frau Hartwig has her hand up and wants to say something.
So here we are. Yes, I would like to know why did you put up this age limit of 18 years? As you know, we don't have any age limit now in Germany after the decision of the Federal Constitutional Court. So I would like to know what were the reasons, what were your kind of the way of this discussion for this age limit. Thank you.
I think there has been the question, so it's being reconsidered in Canada. It's also one thing I should emphasize that, and there's been a lot of consultation and research done around can we safely provide this? But I think the main concern was just one of vulnerable populations, and could children capably give consent? Would there be too much influence from families? So it wasn't that it was a deferred decision so that we could study the situation better and learn better how to safeguard the process if we allow it. And what's currently being tabled is allowing MAID for mature minors. However, not a specific age, but they have to emotionally or cognitively have the ability to understand their decision as mature minors.
Okay. Madeleine, you were discussing this now on clinical and legal and ethical issues. What about economics? We have learned that even your health minister, or ministry at least, has calculated how much money you can save by these C14 and C7 legal changes. At the same time, also calculated that I think it's only 0.08% of all your health expenditure. So how does this weigh into the discussion?
I think people are very uncomfortable having that way into the discussion, but there have certainly been papers showing that there is a significant cost savings from assisted dying. And so there have been published papers actually providing numbers around that. But I genuinely don't think that that's the reason that the government has legalized this. And I don't think it's the motivation for institutions or governments to adopt this.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madeleine. It's now again, a great pleasure to introduce Gary again. We have known each other really for some years now. You started in Rotterdam as a critical friend to one of our EU projects. I remember that. I think it was the Hotel New York, so already across the Atlantic. And we continued in that. And what I really admire always is your is it a third dimension, adding a third dimension or even a fourth dimension to all the discussions we are having. Because as a psychiatrist, of course, you look into the deeper roots of things. And as you just answered to Claudia, is it really different what we are talking about? Or isn't it the same issue in all our countries? So I'm really looking forward to your aspects now, Gary, on the consequences of such a system and legal situation, and what can we maybe learn from that? Can we even prevent all these things, or is it a downhill path? Thank you very much, Gary, for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If someone could put up my slides from your end.
Yes, they will do this. I see the thumb coming up. And then the slides as well, I hope. Yep, they are there.
Okay, they're just small in my version, but I imagine they're full size in yours, are they?
They are, yes.
Yep. You can talk.
Can they be enlarged on our end or not?
Yeah, they are full screen.
Here they are full screen. We can see them.
Okay, so yes, I want to talk about the, as we framed this, the intended but also unintended consequences of assisted dying. And, you know, it's been very difficult, we find, to discuss these issues. Opinions are very polarized, and people's personal morality, strongly held views, often complicate the discussion, I think. But it might be helpful to think of it as we do think about, in the case of medicine, as we think about a medical intervention. I work in the field of cancer, and there's been huge advances in cancer treatments, but all of the treatments have toxicities and side effects. And we might think about this, and this is kind of zooming out from Madeline's perspective, taking a broader range. My slides just disappeared, though, from my end. Can they be put up back, Raymond? There we go. And so there is what I've called the collapse of complexity, that we see these highly polarized views. There's a tendency for people on opposite sides of the debate, everyone to feel they're on the sides of the angels. And often what gets lost is what Madeline and I have called the muddy middle. If you just click again, this complex state in the middle, it's actually where most patients with advanced disease fit. It's where most of the medical community fits, with a lot of uncertainty and complexity. And I think this is hard, I think, to figure into the debate. And it's really the enemy of advocacy, because advocacy in these areas for or against often involves this kind of collapse, you know, putting forth a singular position. Next slide. Now, I think what we can say unequivocally is that a good death can be achieved with assisted dying. So I think we should make that very clear, that many people achieve the kind of death they would like to have, a very peaceful death, in the circumstances that they would like, in the place that they would like, surrounded by the people they want to be with them. And there's very positive feedback we've had from families who participated in this. So I don't think there's any doubt about that, at least not from my point of view, that in many cases a good death can be achieved with assisted dying for people who choose to die in that way. Next slide. And, you know, the medical framework that we've created with Madeline at the University Health Network, I think, is an example of how to build safeguards in. You know, the idea of having time for reflection, of ensuring competency and consent, and having a team of expert providers. We've introduced many aspects which would, I think, bring safety into a medical framework. Next slide. As we open the door, as Germany's considered to broader access, to taking it outside the framework. And there's many good reasons for this. One could say once we move away from a person with advanced disease and we have someone who no longer wants to live, we could say this is maybe no longer a medical intervention, and there can be ownership in the community. But we also lose the safeguards and protections that exist within the medical framework. So it's something for us to contemplate. What are the benefits and consequences of this being moved outside of a medical framework? And as Madeline was saying, in Canada, the recent legislation has kept it within a medical framework, but it's greatly expanded it so that it no longer is for people who are necessarily terminally ill, which is how we initially conceived it. Next slide. So we should think about assisted dying as occurring in a particular cultural context and with a set of assumptions. And there's a tendency for people in countries such as ours to think this is what the world thinks, you know. And in fact, there's about 200 million people in the world that are represented in countries where assisted dying exists. But in fact, it's a particular set of cultural circumstances where we have secularized countries. We heard that 40% of people in Germany no longer belong to an organized church. The population of these countries is growing older. Death and dying is entering the public space. And in countries such as ours, there is a personal value, a cultural value that's placed on personal autonomy, control, and particularly control over the circumstances of dying. So this is a culturally framed intervention. These values are not shared in all parts of the world. Many parts of the world place much less emphasis on personal control, individual autonomy. When we look in Asia, many other countries, Africa, values of communality and family loom much larger than issues of personal control. In fact, one of my colleagues, Christian Nitsamira from Rwanda, he quotes the saying in Africa that says, when you're well, your body belongs to you, and when you're ill, your body belongs to your family. This is a very different conception of the idea of personal autonomy and personal control. Next slide. And a prototype for this, and I think he was a respected person. I knew him, Don Lowe. He was a microbiologist who was a leader in the public health measures when SARS was in Canada. He had a brainstem tumor. He had about as good a death as we can provide, in that he died at home. This video, which you can see online, was made 8 days before death. He had no pain at the time, and he was said to have died in the arms of his wife. But he said, why can't I control the circumstances of my dying? And he was pessimistic that in our country this would occur, even though it was not long after that assisted dying became legal. And his wife was a journalist with our Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I think their advocacy maybe had something to do with why assisted dying became legalized in Canada. Next slide. So when we look at the geography and demographics, it's largely in high-income countries, in Western European countries, in Australia and North America, New Zealand. There's one country, Colombia, in South America, in which it's legal. But this is largely not only in high-income countries, but in the people in the higher socioeconomic groups for whom assisted dying is delivered. It's an interesting circularity, because some people, when they look at the literature, say that, well, it's not vulnerable people that are being assisted dying, because it is people in higher income groups. And in one respect, that's correct, but it really doesn't tell the whole story. It's correct in the sense that it's for those people for whom assisted dying was constructed, and it's for those people that are able to most effectively obtain access to it. Next slide. This is a very different culture than Africa or many other countries, in which, as I said, values of personal autonomy and control are not placed as high, in which death is really a communal phenomenon. Not just death, but the whole process of living with advanced disease. The community rallies forth, whereas people in our culture actually tend to isolate themselves. COVID has certainly enhanced that, but there's a tendency of people who are ill to remove themselves from the community, whereas in other countries they remain much part of the community and supported by the community. Next slide. And so, although we talk about autonomy, the question we can ask is, are these illusions of autonomy? Because that comes out of a particular model, the kind of people we've seen who prototypically request assisted dying. So if we look at some of the cases of people that have requested assisted dying in Canada, next slide. I actually can't read those because my thing is too small. Madeline, can you read them for me if you see them large? Your microphone is off, though.
Yes, so the first case is a 29-year-old pregnant Indigenous woman with chronic non-life-threatening disease and a history of trauma, depression, limited personal, oops, I just lost it. Limited personal, social, and financial support.
Next.
A 75-year-old homeless person with worsening chronic lung disease requesting MAID to avoid having to live in a public nursing home.
Next.
A 27-year-old woman with a psychiatric history with limited finances, living in chronic care, estranged from her family, unable to access appropriate psychiatric care.
Next slide.
And a 77-year-old woman with cancer requesting MAID because she does not believe her husband can or will care for her because she's financially dependent on him and feels unable to leave.
So we can ask the question of whether these kind of cases actually represent autonomy or actually they're a consequence of other phenomena. Next slide. Madeline, if you can read that too, but this is a case that made the media. It was published in our media, and maybe it's provocative to put it that way, but we could wonder whether this is a case of iatrogenic assisted dying. Madeline, if you could read that.
Facing another retirement home lockdown, 90-year-old chooses medically assisted death. Described as exceptionally social and spry, her family says she chose a medically assisted death after she declined so sharply during lockdown that she didn't want to go through more isolation this winter.
Next slide. So, when we evaluate patients, someone talked about the difficulty of evaluating it. We tend to evaluate individuals and individual competence and individual capacity. We tend, I think, not to think as much about the social determinants of health. What is the quality of their food and the stability? What is the nature of their community and social support? What about the circumstances in which they are living? What is their access to high quality health care? And what are their economic circumstances? All of these factors may affect the will to live and decisions to affect MAID. We typically don't assess these. And I do think the idea of individual autonomy, personal autonomy, I think really could be questioned in people that don't have access to these kind of things. These are not the people for whom MAID assisted dying was designed, but these are people, as we've seen, who are beginning to access MAID and may account for the increased frequency of it. Next slide. And so the other thing is, from an individual point of view, that these psychological states are complex, that the desire for death, the will to live, intent to commit suicide, suicidal ideation, these are complex and fluctuating states. As we see, this is a painting of Ophelia in Hamlet, who was both singing and drowning at the same time. And I think, next slide, next slide, if we could, neither law nor medicine, I think, are well constructed. Law and medicine, I think, are evidence-based, and we might say positivistic disciplines, and I don't think they're well positioned to understand the fluctuating, complex nature of psychological states that we may want to take into account in the clinical situation. Next slide. And so when we think about what to do, and this was a question was raised, I do think we may want to think about public health approaches. And MAID came, unlike most things in medicine, MAID came actually from, in Germany and from Canada, from public advocacy and then via the legal route. And so the right to access is what's given priority, the right to have this, to access this legally mandated intervention. There's not as much attention to the social determinants of health that may affect people's psychological state and will to live. And so that we may need to think about public health approaches to both mental health and palliative care when we think about this population. Next slide. So I think as it's been constructed, the access to MAID, I think, involves both human rights and human welfare, but I think it's tilted much more towards the right, the human and equal rights to self-determination, to personal control, and to relief of suffering, and around issues of capacity and consent. Next, I think it's much more difficult in this legal construction to take into account psychological complexity and influence. You know, we talk about competence, but people can be competent and yet highly influenced by their social circumstances and other determinants. We have to think about the balance between people's right to choose and what is our therapeutic responsibility. What is the attention to the social determinants of health? And then the very broad zoom out question is, what is the social good? And as Madeline and I said, that this is something that we won't know for a long time. This is something we can evaluate decades from now or more as to what is the social consequences of this kind of legislation that we're passing. I think that's my last slide. Oh yes, except to say that this is a quote from, can you read that, Madeline, because it's too small for me in my slides. This is a quote from Janet Malcolm, who has written about this kind of problem, particularly in relation to Sylvia Plath.
Life, of course, never gets anyone's entire attention. Death always remains interesting, pulls us, draws us.
Which is why we're here today talking about death, and the messy business of living and living in difficult circumstances is very hard to draw the same kind of excitement and attention. On that note, I'm going to stop and turn it back to Raymond and for discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary, for this third dimension of our discussion today, in showing us that there are these social determinants of health. I like very much your distinction between the individual advice, and this is also part of many of our legal, or some of our legal first drafts of the new law, saying how the individual is going to be evaluated, but there's not very much about the psychosocial. And I think, Frau Hartwig, that will be something your ministry will be really, really important to follow up through the next years. But now let's first, before we go into the panel discussion, hear whether there are any reactions so far.
No reactions so far. The chat is still processing, I think.
Yes, it's high. It needs processing. All thoughts by Gary have to be processed. It takes time. Yeah. And thank you, Madeleine, also for helping out there with the reading. It was very nice having the two Canadians synchronous.
I may do that all the time in the future, Madeleine. You'll have to join me.
Well, it's a good idea. I should take this over to Cologne as well. Don't have to read myself. Okay. Well, if we don't have any discussion points at the moment, we will, I'm sure. Let me introduce the three German panelists here, the discussants, and I'm really looking forward to your first reactions, and that really is something which should lead us into the general discussion. And Gary, we will be playing the facilitation and discussion role between the two of us now. But let me first introduce the three Germans. Of course, I know them better than you do, Gary. Yes. Let me start with the ladies. Frau Professor Barbara Schneider, you are a psychiatrist, fairly close to our hospital. You're leading a large psychiatric hospital there. And you are interested, your main focus is dependency and suicide. And in that role, you are also very much involved, and you are the president of the National Suicide Prevention Program, NASPRO. It's a very nice program. Immediately for our Canadian speakers, it's not based on a legal basis. It's more on a voluntary basis. But yeah, please be welcomed, Barbara Schneider. I will introduce also the next lady beside you, Claudia Frau Professor Claudia Bausewein from Munich. We have known each other since we were very small and very young. You are the chair of palliative medicine in Munich. You are the current chair of, or president of our German Society for Palliative Medicine, and you're also involved in a working group, among many other things, in the German Medical Association, in a working group on principles and ethics there, and maybe can comment on that side as well, what the German Medical Association is thinking about these things. And of course, last not least, Professor Dieter Birnbacher, I'm very glad that you are here. You are a philosopher from Düsseldorf. You're also the vice president, and that's going to be very interesting, your position of the German Society for Humane Dying. Again, this biased use of nomenclature, humane meaning also pro-euthanasia. And you have been, until very recently, the president of the CECO, which is the Central Ethics Committee of our German Medical Association. So you also can talk about the history, maybe a little bit of the discussion within our physicians' body, because, Madeleine, that was something you were pointing towards. Is it medical? Is it not? Is assisting in dying something physicians should do, or it's not their duty? Now, who wants to start? Claudia, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much. Just struggling with the microphone. Well, thank you for the presentations. And for me, it's very thought-provoking, really, and it raises more questions than answers, obviously. I think there are a few key questions for me. It's obviously, what is the role of the doctors? And I mentioned before that obviously this move to call it medical aid in dying implies already that is a medical task or medical duty. And in Germany, Raymond raised that before, it was forbidden for doctors to assist suicide until recently, until the German Medical Association actually dropped this phrase. But there was a vivid discussion about the role of doctors actually, and at least within the German Medical Association, despite all the controversies in the discussion, still the main opinion was that it's actually not a task of a doctor to provide assistance in dying, not meaning that assessment, care, providing medical care and is obviously a physical responsibility. But the question of your sort of intervention team, obviously that wouldn't be possible at the moment in Germany, although the German Medical Association says if a single doctor decides to provide assistance in dying, that will not be prosecuted. But this is different whether an individual does it or whether it is task of the medical profession. So there is still discussions about it, and I think the discussions are continuing and will obviously continue sort of into the next years when we await our legislation. The other topic that is always sort of, for me, very challenging are the societal consequences, or Gary, what you just mentioned sort of about the societal implications of health and of illness, and obviously where a whole situation is moving people into asking for medical aid in dying. And I think it's also a challenge for us as society. How do we want to sort of, what are the conditions that are presented to people in such a vulnerable state? Again, more questions than answers. And finally, this discussion, and I'm very interested in that, what you mentioned before. In Germany, there is still a very strict difference between assisted suicide and killing upon request. That might relate to our history, that might relate to other dimensions, but for me, it would be still a huge difference, actually. And but we know that lawyers, that people are starting to discuss already, if you allow assisted suicide, obviously if somebody is not able to commit the suicide, him or herself, then why is there a sort of, then there would be an inequity, as you said before, for somebody who's, for example, paralyzed. Why should this person not receive then assistance in dying? And as we discuss it, it's still prohibited, and I think many people are still believing in that. But as we start discussing it already, and there are some lawyers who say we have to move towards that. It could be that in 5 years we will discuss that option as well. So many thoughts actually, and questions from my side rather than answers.
Thank you very much, Claudia. But this is the aim of our symposium, isn't it? It's not providing clear answers, it's recreating the complexity which Gary said was collapsing. And of course we know that in our public discussions that complexity is easily collapsing, and we are trying to recollapse it. No, that's not English, right? To recollapse anyway.
We know what you mean. We know what you mean.
Good. Verbal, non-verbal communication. Yeah, maybe because you raised that questions about physicians, maybe I can now ask Dieter Birnbacher to comment on that, because you, of course, you are involved or have been involved in the German Medical Association for a long time. You know the discussions around that. Of course, you are a philosopher, you're not medical. For you, it's sometimes easier to say the medics have to do it. So what are your thoughts which came up?
Let me say first that the Canadian legislation is in one respect admirable. That is the pragmatic and experimental spirit in which it approaches this very complex theme. It's ready to revise regulations, sometimes in the one and sometimes in the other direction. And it even does away with certain clauses in order to reflect for 2 years, as, for example, in the present period. But on the other hand, I think the situation has two central weaknesses, and the one was already mentioned by Claudia Bausewein, that is the making legal euthanasia along with assisted suicide, irrespective of the great differences that exist between these two methods of medically or otherwise aided death, because the threshold is much lower for euthanasia than for assisted suicide. It takes much more of an effort of the patient to make the decision to take his death in his own hands. And that is also the result of our observation of the Dutch situation, that the Dutch situation is much more physician-centered than patient-centered. And the other weakness is the very curious formula of the reasonably foreseeable natural death. I think it very unhappy to have this kind of very interpretable and indeterminate clause in one of the central regulative sentences of the legal situation. But again, back to the physicians' chambers and the history of the attitudes towards assisted suicide. In my long time in the Academy of Medical Ethics, there used to be quite a number of physicians who professed openly to have helped patients with suicide. And there was no great discussion about this. There was always, and there is now, a perfect consensus that assisted suicide should not be a medical obligation or a medical task. But this is, of course, a very weak condition. It holds also in Switzerland, where we know a limited number of doctors support assisted suicide. But interesting is that a survey made by the German Physicians' Chamber around 2011, I think, revealed that at least a third of German physicians could at least think of opportunities in which they might be prepared to assist suicide. The actual rate of assisting suicide seems to have been very low in Germany in all that years. And it remained so during the period 2015 to 2021, when the when the penal law intervened, but they seem to have been rather low also in the period after the professional code being changed in introducing a veto on assisted suicide with the participation of physicians. What I think is interesting is that, and this is just a matter of observation rather, that there is quite a lot of principled conflict in German intellectual circles, in philosophy, in theology, and in medicine also, which is highly polarized, as it is in the population at large. And the discussion is much more principle-oriented than the discussion in Canada. It is interesting that the Ethics Council, the National Ethics Council, started its series of discussions about the issue with a discussion on the legitimacy of suicide as such. And it came out, of course, it's nothing new, that there are highly conflicting views on the legitimacy of suicide. And it is interesting that there is a clear correlation revealed by surveys between the rejection of suicide as such and the rejection of the participation of doctors in the assistance of suicide. And of course, there is a majority of physicians who do not share these very fundamental philosophical or religious objections. An observation I frequently make, but which is nothing more than anecdotal, is that there is also a generational transition going on with the age of doctors. In the younger generation, there is much more readiness to put autonomy, patient autonomy first, and protection not least, but protection not at that same level of urgency. And this is, again, an observation from medical ethics, which is partly done in Germany, at least by physicians. In medical ethics, there is a clear rise in concern for patient autonomy than it was 20 or 30 years ago so far. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Birnbacher, for these first thoughts. I think we continue with Barbara Schneider and then go into the discussion. You raised many, many important issues here, Birnbacher, with the physicians' roles and the generational aspects. We'll be discussing that later. And you criticized the Canadian situation, and maybe the two of you Canadians will take these criticisms up as well. I'm very fond to listen what you have to say to that. But first of all, Frau Schneider, you're really a fully burning with your heart for suicide prevention. That is your life, isn't it? And it must be so difficult to be really hear these discussions in suicide assistance now, and seeing that suicide prevention, what you all have done, is not really supported by the state, or is not really recognized, is it?
Yes, thank you, Professor Voltz. It's I'm very close to Professor Pausebein. I have more questions than answers, and the questions are about the role of doctors, but also about the role of society and about the role of suicide prevention. My first question is, what do society in Canada think about assisted suicide, about euthanasia, and is there no idea about helping people, about supporting people, because I have realized in your examples that there was a lack of financial, personnel, health resources, and the first thing I thought was these people need really help. And what is the role of doctors and who supports the teams, these med staff support teams? What does this really mean? And where are the people who have expertise in suicide prevention? What do they think? I know there are many suicidologists in Canada who have expertise, who are working in this field for many, many years. And also what do people, and especially psychiatrists and all the people who are working in the side, and people who are working in psychology and so on, what do they think about self-determination, the free will, and all these very complex terms? Furthermore, I think it's quite clear in suicidology, and suicidology is a science with evidence that we have to talk about suicide, and the possibility of suicide and assisted suicide must be acknowledged. And this possibility will always be there. And I'm not very near to, very close to Professor Birnbacher, that people are against suicide and then also against assisted suicide. This is everything is very complex, and we have to talk about, and we have not go to the edges, not on the right and not on the left. It's a very complex topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frau Schneider. You don't see it behind the scenes. We are getting some air here in the studio because it's really hot. And with we just received some air with the blackboards saying research on it. Probably we need more research in these things. Okay, thank you very much for the air. Thank you very much, Frau Schneider, for your comments from the point of suicidology, which is a science, which evidence-based, and restricting any methods will reduce the numbers. And I found this quite interesting, Herr Birnbacher, that you also pointed in that direction. And I had the feeling you were supporting the clear distinction to killing upon request, and because of the difference of threshold there. But first of all, let me turn to the Canadians, maybe. You have been criticized for your legal situation. You have received some of the questions, and what about society? What about what is staff support? Who wants to start?
Well, go ahead, Madeline. Why don't you?
I do have one, if I could maybe speak to the issue of euthanasia versus physician-assisted dying, where the patient self-administers. It's so interesting that Canada allows both. And I think that there's a conception that, and I did hear you say that it's because you believe there is a lower threshold with euthanasia, that it's easier for patients to receive somebody else doing it to them as opposed to taking the medication themselves. And I would say in practice, having actually seen this a number of times, provided this to patients, there actually isn't a difference. And that's one of the reasons why the Bill C-14 in Canada requires a patient to be capable at the last moment. And there is a moment where you have the injection lined up in the patient's arm and you have to say, are you sure? And they have the right to say yes, or you're required to give them that moment. And they have the right to say yes or no at that last moment. And there are patients. I think that moment is no different than a patient holding a glass and deciding to swallow something that is lethal. There are patients who change their minds at that moment. And I think that's one of the reasons Canada really, or providers really struggle with the waiver of consent that is now in Bill C7, because patients no longer will face that, necessarily need to face that last moment. So providers struggle with that. And that, I think, is the true distinction between physicians providing it and patients doing it themselves. It's not the patients where there's a difference, it's the clinicians. That in many ways, clinicians are uncomfortable with it because it makes us a little more complicit in providing this. I crossed that barrier because actually I don't think there's an ethical difference between providing it to a patient or having a patient take it themselves. If you've approved them, they're eligible. I don't think there's an ethical difference. There's an experiential difference for the provider. And in terms of safety, I think it's the same.
I agree with Madeline on that point. I think that that the person who delivers it, as Madeline says, and the person who writes a prescription for it, I think bear equal responsibility, although psychologically it may not feel, it may feel more distant for the provider. I think there's more barriers when it's constructed medically, actually. There's a machinery and a bureaucracy that's involved in the medical delivery of assisted dying, which I think, if anything, makes it a little more difficult, and that could be an argument. The other thing I think that we've observed in Canada is that there's a difference in how the public views it and how the medical and palliative care community have viewed it. By and large, certainly the palliative care community have not wanted to own assisted dying. They've made it very clear that they see this as something different than palliative and end-of-life care. And I think to some extent, it's become normalized in medicine, but largely because it's legalized, not because it's something doctors as a group especially wanted. I think the Canadian public does not make a distinction between assisted dying and palliative and end-of-life care. They see this as part of palliative and end-of-life care. They don't make that meaningful distinction. And actually, I think it got constructed as made medical assistance in dying because the Canadian public wanted medical people involved. They wanted to be, they wanted the ritual, the dignity, the normalization, and the protection of it being involved in the medical community. People now put it sometimes in their obituaries. And it's a very interesting thing. We talk about autonomy. There's a medical anthropologist that has referred to this actually as choreographed dependency, because in fact, it's a highly dependent situation when you're allowing someone else, or you're giving your life over to someone else within a medical framework. So there's a kind of autonomy and there's a kind of choreographed dependency in it. But this is a difference between how the Canadian public views it, I believe, and how the palliative care for sure community views it.
But Gary, isn't handing over the autonomy contradictory to autonomy at the end of life? Because in a way you're getting dependent on a person, obviously a physician, but that's not autonomy anymore. It's dependence, isn't it?
Therefore, what are you saying?
Sorry?
And therefore what? Therefore, what is it? What would you conclude from that?
My understanding was that you're arguing for killing upon request could be sort of an option, but maybe I misunderstood you. But in a way, in Germany, it's always the sort of big discussion and the emphasis on autonomy and being autonomous and giving you, and therefore you have the right for suicide, and then obviously assisted suicide, where there's no doubt about. But the discussion about autonomy would then, for me, contradict itself if you also allow killing upon request. And even the question for assisted suicide is if sort of professionals or if doctors are involved, again, is that not handing over some part of your autonomy?
So firstly, I'm not arguing, I wasn't arguing actually for or against it. I was just describing how the Canadian public feels about it. And yes, it is contradictory. That is the complexity, that a person can feel a sense of autonomy while also being in this choreographed kind of dependency. There is that complexity in it. Now, it's a separate argument about whether that's a good or a bad thing. I wasn't arguing for or against it. I was speaking to the experience of it and how it's constructed. I think there was another comment, though.
Birnbacher wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think there are a number of further reasons because of which there is a difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide. One is the one you just mentioned. It's the symbolic one. Assisted suicide is more symbolically expressing the true autonomy of the person who is ultimately responsible for his own death and doesn't give this authority away in his or her last minutes. But I think an observation is in place, which we in Germany have particular from the experience in the Netherlands, because I think the fact that in the Netherlands euthanasia is in principle possible and sometimes executed upon advance requests is something of a slippery slope. And of course, this argument is not quite out of the world. I mean, there are all kinds of objections against slippery slope arguments, but we have the experience that this is going one step too far. And it is highly dubitable whether this step would have been undertaken with assisted suicide and not with euthanasia, where the sort of action, the ultimate action, is carried out by someone different from the patient. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we could continue for hours. We called it a mini symposium, Gary, to limit it to 2 hours, but we are already 10 minutes before the end of these 2 hours. So at least we want to open up the discussion now to the chat room. And Kathleen Buschström, what do you have to summarize?
We have 3 comments in the chat by now, 2 referring to Gary Roden's talk. Just read them. One is from Lillian Thorpe. She writes that it was an excellent presentation and that she teaches her students that some interventions are legal, such as heart transplants, but are not good practice in all patients. And this is particularly important for MAID as this is an irrevocable act. So that is her comment.
I agree with that.
Then I would just continue with Caroline Variet. She thanks again Dr. Roden for the excellent talk. And she writes that the relational influences of autonomy are often forgotten. And it's an approach that should be used in all aspects of healthcare. And for MAID, there's an opportunity to improve this using a multidisciplinary team approach, as it can be time and resource consuming.
Do you want to comment maybe, Madeleine? It was also a question from Barbara Schneider for the staff, how you, this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach you take as a safeguard, right? And how do you protect the staff? Maybe you can comment on that after we have heard the next comment. Maybe we summarize then. Yeah.
All right, the next comment is actually quite fitting to the one before. It's from Kevin Reel, who writes that decisional autonomy does not necessarily align with executive autonomy, and that professionals can administer the procedure far more safely and securely than non-professionals.
So it's about the professional input and the professional safeguard, which, Madeleine, you said failed because of the legal situation to limit it. But still, you tried it in your institution. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this multi-professional, holistic diagnosis and how you support these teams.
I think it's a really important point around protecting the healthcare providers around it. And so what we did in our framework was first to make sure that participation in anything related to assisted dying was entirely voluntary. And so those who choose to participate are people without conscientious objection. And what we found, which was really interesting, was that where the distress was amongst teams was not in the people actually assessing and providing MAID, but in the indirect healthcare providers, the nurses on the unit, the people who were not involved. And it was as granular as the pharmacy technicians who had to draw up these medications and knew what the intent was. And that's why we created, in our model, a staff support team, this multidisciplinary team, not to protect the patient necessarily, but to protect the staff. And what we would do is we actually had a clear structure where before every intervention, depending on the location of the patient, we would meet with the teams beforehand and debrief and give them an opportunity to understand this patient's request, understand the patient, and then if they had any concerns around it, if there were nurses who objected, to make sure to schedule them to be off the unit at the time of the intervention. And then after the intervention, we would do a debrief with staff. And that involved spiritual care and readings and music therapy. And what we actually found, those became less and less necessary over time, because what was clear was that MAID deaths ultimately were not that different from any other death. That the main source of stress for staff was the fact that this patient they cared for a while had died, regardless of how they had died. And the practice became normalized. And so we were very careful about supporting staff initially, and that has become less needed over time.
Normalized, as you say, right? So it became a normal way of dying in Canada in your situation. Gary, do you want to comment on that as well?
Well, I agree with that, what Madeline has said. I'm still thinking about this issue of autonomy, which is a very interesting one. Human beings are actually not autonomous. Human beings are socially constructed. Even people who are, and I value autonomy actually in many respects, but even people who are placing a value on autonomy are doing that in relation to others. It's actually a relational construct in any case. And apart from the point I made about the social circumstances that are not taken into account when we think about autonomy, which is that it's often illusory to think that a person who doesn't have the proper means of support is making autonomous decisions. When we say that autonomy is the ultimate value, that's a cultural decision that we make. It's not shared in many cultures. It may be a value in our culture. But the concern I have about it is that and this may have particular relevance in Germany, is that it disowns responsibility. That if I can say that the patient is perfectly autonomous, then I'm off the hook. I'm not responsible. And I think that is convenient, but I question whether that is the wisdom, not just of the medical profession, but of society that we want to take for other people.
That's a very, yeah, Claudia, it's very deep. I mean, we can talk a long time about this, what sort of autonomy is in our heads when we talk about autonomous decisions. Claudia, you raised your hands.
Yeah, I raised my hand just because we're coming to an end, and there is sort of a question and an observation. For me, it sounds like MAID has become sort of normal in Canadian society. It's one option how to end one's life. And I think in Germany, there's the discussion of the court saying we should try that it's not a normal way to end one's life. And the other one is a real question, if you would go back now 5 years, or if you would be in the situation that we are, what would you do differently, or what would you recommend? Because in a way there was this discussion about the slippery slope regarding euthanasia, but if I look at your numbers, obviously some people say that's a slippery slope, others would say this is just meeting the demand, and the demand is rising. It's always an option of sort of point of view. For me, it's still a slippery slope, is what you are telling about sort of opening or widening the regulations. And I think we have seen that in many other countries. There's hardly one country where the numbers are actually staying equal. Even in Oregon, they are rising. And so my question would be, what do you recommend to us, or maybe it's easier for you to say, what would you do differently now if you would go back 5 years and sort of restart the process?
I think the answer to that question is there isn't one answer to the question. And if you would ask Madeline and I, or you would ask people in the community of MAID providers, if you would ask the community, you'd have different answers. And I think we're almost going to need another symposium, I think, to answer that question. It depends on what values you start with, and what priorities you start with. And then I think the way in which you structure the way MAID is provided, or assisted dying is provided, follows from that, which I think you could ask, Mel and I could maybe, or differently, could give our opinions about that, but there isn't one opinion about that. It really depends on what the values you want to prioritize. And then I think the legislation follows from that. We've tried to raise, I think that's the point of the idea of consequences and unintended consequences, that there are consequences and there are benefits and values. And I think Germany, like any other country, has to weigh where you position that. It's like the dosage of a drug, maybe, or is you have to weigh what is the benefit and what is the risk of whatever decision that you make, I would say.
I think we have time for we take one last more comment, and then we go back to a last round and maybe last words from each of you briefly for a last round.
All right, there's another comment in the chat from Erika Preisig. She writes she is a medical doctor and leading an organization for assisted dying in Switzerland. And she says it's very interesting to hear from Dr. Bausewein that she thinks people are handing over autonomies when they ask for assisted dying. She is so right, but these people are very thankful for the help they get from medical professionals. And they are not afraid of death, but are afraid it could go wrong and that they cannot die. So they are happy to execute their wish to die and do not mind to hand over some autonomy.
Okay. Yeah, this question of autonomy on the philosophical, on the practical side, we have discussed that, and where's the boundary to that? Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I'm afraid we are already at the end of our symposium. Maybe, Gary, there will be times where we go into more depth. Let's see how the discussion in Germany is going on, and then maybe we can have some more follow-up symposium. It's easy to organize nowadays, although, Madeleine, you will be coming over to Cologne at some point after the pandemic, I'm sure. Last words, which is really the right thing for this topic. From you, do you want to say something you took with you, something which was imminent in your, which sticks in your brain from this discussion tonight, today, this morning, wherever in the world you are? Do you want to start, Madeleine, maybe? I just start on my screen here, going from left to right.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate the discussion. I appreciate the panelists for their perspectives and that they're really giving such careful and broad consideration to a very critical topic. I've really very much enjoyed this today. Thank you.
Recollapsing complexity. Thank you, Madeleine. Claudia?
This is definitely a term I learned, collapsing complexity, which I think the discussion showed, and I think we just, for me, scratched the surface really, because it is such a complex issue. And what I really enjoy is your very differentiated view, because I think polarization is not helping in this at all, and that's what we have in Germany quite a bit. And I think it's always challenging to move people to understand and to acknowledge that there is no easy answer. And sometimes I have a feeling that people would prefer easy answers, because it's obviously much easier way forward rather than to dig into the complexity, but I think we have to do it. And as I say, for me, there are more questions than answers, but it's very interesting to hear your view, sort of where you feel that the medical profession has such a central position, which I still struggle with, I have to admit. But as I say, I hope that we have another symposium on this, on whatever the development will be in a few years. And it's really great that you shared your experiences and your views and were very open about the challenges. And that's really helpful for us. Thank you very much.
Schneider.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I have learned a lot, and I think I'm not the only one who have learned a lot. And we saw that this is a very complex issue, and we have to think about, and we have to talk about this. And but I think something I will say again, I think people need help for living. And I think this is something which is very essential. And I think we have, when we think in Germany about assisted suicide, and then we have also think about help for people, and we have also think about regulations and what we can do that assisted suicide and euthanasia do not become a normal way of dying. And I think we have to think about, and we have not only to think about in very shortly, but for a longer time about this really complex material. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Herr Birnbacher.
Yes, thank you. My congratulations on these excellent presentations once more. There was a time in Germany when the contradiction was made between palliative care and assisted suicide. This has been retreated in the attention of the public, but there seems to be still a contradiction made between the admittance of assisted suicide on the one hand and suicide prevention on the other. And I think there is a point, namely counseling in the context of assisted suicide, which might serve as a medium to identify patients, to identify cases with a psychiatric or other highly dependent background, so that it might be possible to reconcile these two issues of giving people an opportunity to have a self-determined death on the one hand, and on the other hand, to identify patients whose life conditions, whose surrounding conditions can and should be changed so that their death wish no longer obtains. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Frau Hartwig, do you want to say last words? No, but I think what I took from here is the social determinants of healthcare, and that is something I think your ministry is really the one to have to look into that in the future, and that autonomy and all these things really are biased by these, and the cases Gary presented are really telling, I think. These are the unintended consequences. Who is it who really looks like that and looks for assistance in whatever we call it? Gary, very last words from your side.
Well, Raymond, firstly, I would just want to thank you and your whole team for partnering with us and organizing this event. I think if this were a meal, I think we'd say we've only had an appetizer, that this is, I think, the beginning of a very large conversation, but I think it's been a very interesting one. And I appreciate the spirit of inquiry and curiosity and seriousness that everyone's approaching it. And, you know, I was thinking that we've developed an intervention, a psychotherapeutic intervention for people with advanced cancer, and we refer to it as dealing with the practical and the profound. And that would be my comment to all of you who are in Germany are thinking about this, that both of those need to be addressed. There's all the practical issues about how do you address assisted dying, but I think there's very profound societal, social and psychological implications that need to be taken into account as well. And it's not easy to do those both, to think both practically and also in a much broader way. But I think that is the challenge. I think Madeline and I would be delighted to engage with all of you subsequently as you proceed through this process, and to think about how your thinking is involved in it. It is kind of a deja vu, I think, for us, because we went through a similar kind of process in Canada.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I know where your heart is, Gary, because when we met first in around care of the dying, you said it's like care of the dying is like a meal as well. So here we are again, this is like a meal. So if you want to prepare a good meal at the end, if you want to care for in the dying phase, you have to see what your shopping is like. So you have to start very early on with good palliative care. So I hope that at some point in the not so far future, we really can have a physical meal at the in the end, some here or there across the Atlantic. But for the beginning, this was a first course, as you said, and I hope there will be a second course for the discussion and maybe a dessert as well, at least 3 courses, right, in this complex discussion, which we try to make complex. And it's good that we have more questions than answers, I think, because also our viewers, all of you out there, and this will be put on YouTube, so also our members of parliament, once they are able to make discussions, can also view this and start and refine maybe their laws with some of the input we have heard today. So thank you very much for flying over from Canada to Cologne. Thank you for the chat, lady Kathleen Buchström. Thank you for all of you, the discussants, and thank you back there for all the technical help. And it did work, surprisingly. I'm really surprised. It didn't crash, it worked. So thank you very much indeed for everybody, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Stay
Ciao.
safe.